You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda from New York City.
This is Prashant Parameswaran from Washington, D.C.
How's it going today, Prashant?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing well. We're coming up on the end of 2018 here. It's been an exciting week of news, certainly in the United States.
hmm
But as we do with the podcast around the year's end, and we did on the most recent episode, I think it's a good opportunity to talk about the year ahead, 2019, and sort of lay out some of the things to watch for and to pay attention to. And I think we've done this in recent years where we've kind of laid out the electoral landscape in Asia for the year ahead. So 2019, it actually turns out, is going to be a pretty significant year for democracy in Asia. Around, two countries in particular, India and Indonesia, are home to 1.6 billion people between them, and both of them are going to be having major elections. Indonesia is going to have presidential elections on April 17th, and India will have elections for the lower house or general elections that will determine which party will get to field the next prime minister. So for Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the next 6 months are really kind of a sprint to the finish line of these new general elections. And apart from that, we'll also briefly touch on some of the other elections that are on the horizon. Afghanistan is scheduled to have a presidential election on April 20th, but there are some ambiguities there about whether that will go ahead on schedule or whether there'll be delays due to a range of factors. And later in the year, the Philippines is scheduled to hold midterm elections, which won't have any effect on the leadership. The national leadership, President Duterte will remain in office, but it will be for for offices across the country. So we can talk a bit about that, and also Prashant, we can also discuss what the Thais have in plan for their
hmm
February elections and if those are going to go on ahead. So I guess why don't we start with Indonesia? I think that's probably a good straightforward place to begin this conversation. So. Prashant, tell us a bit about kind of the lay of the land in Indonesia leading up to these elections. So the most notable thing that jumps out to a lot of the observers that is, you're basically going to have a rematch between the same two personalities, Jokowi and Prabowo, going into this. But what has changed since the last elections in 2014?
Yeah, so that's the sort of the broad overview, which is that, I mean, you're right. It is kind of seems like a little bit of a deja vu, right? Went back to the 2014 elections where you have the this time the incumbent Joko Widodo against Prabowo Subianto. I think there's two key things that are a little bit different. One is I think we now have a sense, and it was clear when Jokowi came to office, and this is since this is a geopolitical podcast, you know, his foreign policy has been quite disappointing in terms of, Indonesia's traditionally been seen as a leader on the world stage and also in Southeast Asia. But we've seen the Indonesians not really have a very strong, coherent foreign policy. It's been very domestic focused. It's not that there haven't been priorities that are advanced, but it's definitely quite a shift from what we saw under the former president. So that's one angle I think that to watch now that we have a clear sense of that Jokowi has tended to have a more domestic focused foreign policy. What could we see in a second term that might change, if anything, or are we just going to see a continuation of what we saw in the first term? The other thing that has changed is, and I wouldn't say this is a radical departure, but it's just an intensification. The concerns around the exercise of democracy in elections itself, there are a lot more concerns on that front. So whether it's the proliferation of fake news, the fact that Indonesian democracy, there's a sense that there's a lot more sort of radical Islamist messaging that's going around. It's a perception more than a reality. This has always been kind of a tug of war between moderates and more radical factions. And then also cybersecurity. I mean, there's real fears. There could be instances of hacking that could undermine the actual exercise of the election itself. So I'd say, I mean, those are the two main things that have changed. But in general, though, you're going to see a lot more continuity as these elections come to fore, right? So, whether it's cash handouts by Jokowi, Prabowo questioning, Jokowi's, whether it's his credentials in governing or his religious background, a lot more courting of the Islamist vote. So these are things that are very sort of continuous in Indonesian elections, but I think those would be the two big changes that we'd see.
Yeah, the note on political Islam that you mentioned is quite interesting, especially the questioning of Jokowi's credentials. So one of the factors that kind of stood out to me is Jokowi's running mate is a Muslim cleric, Maruf Amin of Nahdlatul Ulama, the world's largest Muslim organization. What do you think? What effect is that having on the race, and do you think that's effectively going to help Jokowi out in the elections? I mean, do you have a prediction, first of all, for how the election is likely to go based on polling and other dynamics right now in Indonesia?
Yeah, I think Jokowi's position is quite strong. So I think he's still the favorite and the one to beat. But the experience that we had in the election in 2014 shows that in Indonesia, you really shouldn't count the votes before the election actually happened. I mean, in fact, in 2014, in the weeks leading up to the election, Jokowi's lead narrowed significantly, and it looked like Prabowo was actually going to win. And so it ended up being a very slim victory for him. So that's, I think, on the outcome front. In terms of political Islam and the appointment of his running mate, Maruf Amin, I think it really depends on the spectrum of views that you have. I think there are more pragmatic observers who would say, look, this is something that Jokowi needed to do. He needed to appoint somebody who had these religious credentials in order to protect himself from Prabowo and other observers. But I think there are other folks who are, of a different view, which is that, the way to stand up to these forces is actually to very strongly distance yourself from them and employ different tactics from what we've seen in the past. I mean, the former Indonesian president, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, was infamous for this, where he used to give in several times to, so-called Islamist groups, in fact, co-opting them into his coalition as well. And that led him to actually take a very hard stance in terms of, for religious groups, and led to significant consequences for Indonesia and its reputation as a moderate Muslim country. So I think there's different views on that, but I do sense, I mean, when I've been to Indonesia last few months, there really is a sense of disappointment that Jokowi has had to resort to this in order to win the election. But on the other hand, I really do think there are observers who think, this is by no means an assured victory for Jokowi. So this is something that he might need to do.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think the other big one for Asia elections in 2019, as you mentioned, is India. And I think, interesting because when Jokowi and Modi came onto the world stage, I mean, we really did see this. This was the beginning of the phase of so-called, populist leaders or a populist wave in Asia, right? And so it's interesting to see that we're now in 2019 back to these two leaders back in office, to see, even though in Indonesia it's presidential elections and in India it's parliamentary. But what's your sense of, what are the big things we should be looking for as India heads to that election, both in terms of Modi's position, but then also, I guess, for listeners, as you probably mentioned briefly too, in previous conversations we've had on India, India's tradition is of, the previous years we've seen coalition governments and very messy politics. I mean, is there, what is the risk that we might return to that in the years that follow?
Yeah, so I'll kind of begin with my kind of top line prediction 6 months out, which is likely to be wrong. I mean, it's dangerous to predict the future, but I'll do it anyways on this podcast. I mean, my best guess for what happens in late April, May 2019, when the Indian Lok Sabha elections go down, is that the BJP will win, but it won't win with the kind of margin that it gained in 2014, which was mainly, in my view, a result of massive anti-incumbency sentiment against the Congress party, which still exists in India, but the Congress is doing better than it has been. More on that in a bit. But in general, I think the BJP is likely to still come out on top, with Modi safely probably securing himself another term in office, but it will have to do so with coalition partners. And that's where I think it's going to I think we're going to see if the BJP's partnerships across the country with various regional parties are going to end up paying dividends. Because I think the big story in Indian politics over the last 5 years has been the increased prominence of regional parties across the country as the BJP has kind of consolidated its power on the national level. So the Indian National Congress, which was historically dominant in India, has really been struggling in the last 5 years, primarily due to its kind of old-fashioned clinging to the dynastic politics of the Gandhi family. Rahul Gandhi is still kind of the face of the party, and he's just not seen as a charismatic type to really compete with someone like Narendra Modi, who is widely perceived to be charismatic. But at the same time, anti-incumbency is a powerful force in Indian politics. I think that's clearly a lesson that we take away from Indian political history. So the BJP, I think, is going to be facing some of that, right? So this week for this podcast is quite interesting because the BJP just lost several assembly elections in three critical states. I wouldn't read too much into that because the way districting works for the Lok Sabha elections is quite different, and the BJP actually managed a significant vote share. It's just the nature of, first past the post voting that didn't work out in their favor in these particular elections. But so when it comes to anti-incumbency sentiment of the BJP, I think one of the issues that's going to be important to watch is, the economic referendum on Modi, I think, is going to be tough for the BJP. I mean, there are issues that the urban middle classes care about that the BJP has really sort of botched and doesn't really have time to fix. Demonetization is obviously the whopper when that was implemented in November 2016, the same year as the same week actually as the U.S. presidential elections. Effectively, the Modi government took a page out of heterodox economics and basically removed from the money supply about 86% of the actual notes in circulation and replaced them with new notes, and that caused kind of major crisis across the country. It ended up hurting a lot of people, particularly the vulnerable rural poor who weren't able to exchange their savings and things like that. So that was kind of widely regarded as a crisis. But the Modi government is doubling down on the legacy of demonetization, right? So the Reserve Bank of India's chairman, Urjit Patel, just stepped down, and he's been replaced with the former finance secretary, who was one of the main cheerleaders of this policy. So the BJP isn't acknowledging that it did anything wrong or this was a misstep. It's really kind of doubling down on its economic record here. The other issue, which was kind of more a process of botched implementation rather than conception, is the goods and services tax, which hasn't really been implemented in the way that at least many foreign investors hope. So these two issues, I think, really concern kind of the wealthy upper and upper middle class urban citizens in India, many of whom have come around to supporting the BJP, which in 2014 came to power with the slogan of minimum government, maximum governance. So the idea was that they would really help India break out of its lull, under the Congress rule over the past decade and spur in a new era of growth. And for a moment, it seemed like that was true. India was posting fantastic growth numbers. It was the fastest growing large emerging economy in the world. But these doldrums have really set in. The other issue is on economic issues. I think the BJP is going to have to answer for some of the grievances among powerful, large voting groups in India, including farmers, who I think perceive the government to have been unable to deliver on significant promises that have been made. So I think this 2019 election is going to be interesting. I mean, the BJP is certainly still in a nationally dominant position. Its biggest threat, if anything, is not the Congress Party, but really I think the election is going to come down to how much of a referendum this turns out to be on Modi and specifically some of these big economic policies that I discussed, but also how the regional parties factor in. The Congress could pull off something big if it managed to actually build the kinds of coalitions necessary going into the election to actually put up a significant challenge to the BJP's own coalition building. So I think there'll be interesting times ahead in May after these elections. But as far as foreign policy goes, I think it's actually going to be a pretty minor issue in the overall general elections in India, as they kind of historically happen in the past.
So maybe from there, I guess we can switch quickly to some of the others. So Afghanistan is one, which you mentioned. That's, I think, scheduled to happen in April. Given the fact that, as you said, I mean, first of all, we're not sure if it's actually going to be held. I mean, the parliamentary elections themselves were held quite late, and amidst a lot of violence. But I guess this is happening at an interesting time more broadly for Afghanistan because President Trump and his approach and strategy to Afghanistan, it offers an interesting angle and contrast. And it might also tell us a little bit about Ghani and his domestic political position and some of the other internal dynamics there, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so they are scheduled for April. The possibility of a delay, I think, is quite likely at this point,
Hmm.
primarily due to kind of safety and logistical issues. I mean, the fundamental problem with all these delayed elections in Afghanistan, and one of the issues that came up with the National Unity Government when it was formed in 2014, was the fundamental issue of the legitimacy of the Afghan political system. Right? I mean, a big part of the conflict between the Taliban and the Afghan government is over the legitimacy of the state itself, and continuous delays to elections, disagreements over the outcomes of those elections, the conduct of those elections, really chip away at the Afghan state's legitimacy. So there is, I think, a strong interest to have these elections on time. It's just that I think practical factors will make that less likely. And
Hmm.
yeah, as we saw with the parliamentary elections, they were delayed by about 3 years, and there was still massive violence. So a lot can still happen in the 5 months that remain before the scheduled date.
Hmm.
I'm not optimistic that the ongoing peace talks with Zalmay Khalilzad leading the process for the United States will produce a breakthrough that will allow these elections to happen on time and occur without any major hitches. I think Ashraf Ghani is on board with having the Taliban participate politically, even. But I think given events on the ground in Afghanistan, I think that all seems quite unlikely. So I guess the bottom line on Afghanistan is kind of we just have to wait and see if these elections will actually end up going forward. But along similar lines, Prashant, I think that's actually a good segue maybe to talk a bit about, I guess, what could potentially be the first major Asian election of the year if it does happen, which is the scheduled elections in Thailand.
Hmm.
So February 24th is the date still, I understand, but is this going to go forward?
Yeah, I mean, I guess similar lines in the sense that since the coup and the government takeover, there have been promises of elections over multiple years and several delays now. I think this time there is a sort of sense by the government that they do need to hold these polls. I mean, they've been postponing this for a long time. We've seen them do things like ease some bans that have been placed on political parties and actors ahead of elections. So all signs are that they probably will do this. The other incentive that they have to do it early on in the year and not further postpone it is that it gets that out of the way before Thailand embarks on its ASEAN chairmanship through the rest of the year. I mean, it will officially hold it for the whole of next year. But it's before a lot of the legwork will begin, and you see a lot of the summitry that goes on in Thailand. The reason why that's significant is the last time Thailand held the ASEAN chairmanship, you literally had a case where there was violence amid these meetings, and they actually had to be stopped and halted. And that was a big embarrassment for Thailand. So there is that additional sort of foreign policy, if you like, reason for why they need to hold this. The big question, though, for Thailand is, the simple bumper sticker, which is, will these elections actually matter? Because essentially, during the period since the junta took over, they've been basically doing all they can to ensure that there won't be a clear and significant victory for any of the parties that are linked to former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra. And so essentially they've altered the rules. They've made sure that there are political restrictions on certain parties that oppose them and that they don't especially like. And so even if the elections are held, I mean, I'm not sure that this is going to actually fundamentally resolve the Thai political conundrum, which, we've been dealing now. We talk about political transition. I mean, since Thaksin came to power and he was ousted in the initial coup, that was back in 2001. So we're really talking about, nearly 2 decades of Thailand's domestic political transition. So I'm afraid, I mean, even though I'd like to think that this election will get Thailand through this political mess that it's in, I think it's just another phase in Thais trying to figure out the balance between various aspects of rule, right? One is democratic rule, but then also making sure that there's adequate space in Thailand for these political elites, whether it's the new king that's been installed, the military, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so if they do announce a delay or another postponement, is that going to in itself cause instability and violence? Do you think?
Yeah, that's the risk. I mean, I think the calculation that many experts have had in mind is that the longer that these delays are put in place, the stronger and fiercer the negative sentiment will be against the government and the military. So I definitely think that, especially this time around, there will be some violence, and then the issue becomes really how does the military respond, whether it's through force, and how Thailand's politics unravel in response.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
So to close this out, I guess, at the end of June, or I guess in May, with the winners taking office in late June, rather, we have midterm elections in the Philippines, which we've talked about repeatedly on this podcast, kind of the domestic politics in the Philippines and kind of Rodrigo Duterte's popularity levels. But what are some of the issues to watch here? And is there a potential foreign policy angle to the outcome of the Philippine midterm results in your view?
Yeah, so usually these elections, midterm elections in the Philippines, are not very closely monitored. There are things that take place, and there are actually, I mean, this is a big exercise in democracy. You're talking about representatives, you're talking about governors, you're talking about mayors, councilors, all the way down. So this is a significant exercise in democracy, but it usually doesn't get as much coverage. But I suspect, as you noted, because this has to do with President Duterte and his time in power. And, analysts have been looking for any opportunity to kind of assess what his popularity will be, irrespective of the outcome. I think you are going to see significant coverage of these elections as a sort of litmus test for Duterte's popularity. I don't think you'll see too much of a sort of change on foreign policy front. But what I would say is there are a lot of domestic priorities that Duterte has, put forward. Some of these with respect to the Southern Philippine peace process, for example. He's talked about federalism. He's talked about constitutional revision and change. These are things which I think worry a lot of political observers because of the Philippines. I mean, several of the presidents since the Philippines became a recent wave of democracy in 1986, haven't finished their term in office. And in the Philippines, it's a single 6-year term. So I think people will be looking to see how Duterte manages this legitimacy question amid a lot of these priorities that he's been throwing around.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that about covers the major elections.
Hmm.
There are a few others, namely the parliamentary elections in the Maldives, but we can probably get back to that closer to the actual date. Certainly, we've
Yeah,
discussed the politics there recently. But Prashant, thanks a lot for joining me as always.
be with you.
Absolutely. For our listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast, but you haven't subscribed yet, make sure you do that so you don't miss future episodes. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, but you haven't yet left us a review on either iTunes or Google Play, please go ahead and do that. It really helps get the word out about the show. And if you have any suggestions about something you'd like to hear us talk about on this podcast or a potential recommendation for a guest, feel free to shoot either of us a message about that. We'd be very happy to take it into consideration. So in the meantime, thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more